It is perhaps the most famous image in the history of space exploration. Not a rocket soaring to the stars, but a twisted cloud of white smoke branching out against a perfect blue sky. In just 73 seconds, the Space Shuttle Challenger went from a symbol of American pride to a rain of debris falling into the Atlantic Ocean. 7 lives were extinguished in front of the entire world. Millions of schoolchildren were watching live on TV, cheering for Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space. It was supposed to be the ultimate lesson. Instead, it became a national trauma that ended the age of innocence for NASA. But this was not an unavoidable accident. The night before the launch, engineers begged NASA not to fly. They knew a simple rubber seal, frozen by the Florida winter, would turn the shuttle into a bomb, and yet the order was given: launch. To understand how the American dream of spaceflight lost its innocence, we must rewind the clock. The date is January 28, 1986. It is a morning of crystalline beauty at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The air is sharp, painfully cold, and utterly still. This is not the humid, sweltering Florida that tourists know. A freak Arctic front has descended upon the Sunshine State, freezing citrus crops in the groves and turning the launch pad into an ice sculpture. For the United States, 1986 feels like a turning point. The recession of the early decade is fading. Top Gun is about to hit theaters. President Ronald Reagan is preparing for his State of the Union address, scheduled for this very evening. There is a sense of muscular patriotism in the air, a belief that American technology can conquer any frontier. And at the center of this national confidence sits the Space Shuttle program. By 1986, the shuttle is no longer seen as an experimental miracle. It has become a space truck. This is the 25th mission of the program, designated STS-51L. The public has grown somewhat complacent. Launches are no longer front-page news on their own merits. The miracle of vertical flight has become routine, almost mundane. But this flight is different. This flight has captured the imagination of the public in a way no mission has since the moon landings. Sitting on Pad 39B, the Orbiter Challenger is a brooding beast of black and white tiles, tethered to a massive orange external tank and 2 slender white solid rocket boosters. It is a technological titan, waiting to scream its way into history. Inside the crew quarters, the atmosphere is electric. This is not just a crew of military test pilots. This is a crew that looks like America. Commanding the mission is Francis Dick Scobie, 46, a calm, stoic presence with the square jaw of a classic aviator. Beside him is pilot Michael Smith, making his first flight, his voice the one that will be heard on the loop until the very end. There is Judith Resnick, the second American woman in space, brilliant and focused. There is Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian American in space, a man of humble Hawaiian origins and immense talent. There is Ronald McNair, a physicist and an accomplished jazz saxophonist who planned to record the first musical solo in orbit. There is Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist representing the engineers who built these satellites. But the heart of the mission, the reason millions of children are watching, is Krista McAuliffe. Krista is not a pilot. She is not a scientist. She is a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. She was chosen from more than 11,000 applicants for the Teacher in Space program. She is the proxy for every ordinary citizen who ever looked up and dreamed. She is going to teach lessons from orbit. Her presence has turned a routine satellite deployment mission into a national event. Because of her, the cameras are rolling. Because of her, the stakes are impossibly high. If you are interested in the hidden histories behind the events that shaped our world, consider subscribing. However, beneath the smiles and the photo ops, a dark tension is simmering behind the scenes. The cold wave gripping Florida is historic. Temperatures at the launch pad have dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. This is weather for ice fishing, not for launching delicate aerospace equipment. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, the 2 white rockets on the sides, are in a state of panic. In a teleconference the night before, they pleaded with NASA managers, "Do not launch." They possess data, messy, inconclusive, but terrifying data, suggesting that the O-rings, the rubber seals that keep the explosive burning gas inside the boosters, might fail in extreme cold. Rubber, when frozen, loses its elasticity. It becomes hard. It doesn't bounce back. If the O-ring doesn't seal in the first milliseconds of ignition, the result could be catastrophic. But NASA is under pressure. The launch has already been delayed multiple times. The schedule is tight. The managers at Marshall Space Flight Center, driven by a culture of go fever, challenge the engineers. They demand proof that it will fail, rather than proof that it is safe. "My God, Theocol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" a NASA manager famously asks. Overruled and beaten down, the Theocol engineers sign off on the launch. But at home in Utah, one engineer goes to bed telling his wife, "It's going to blow up." Back on the pad, the sun rises. The ice team inspects the shuttle. There are icicles hanging from the service structure, some feet long. It looks like a scene from the Arctic. But the sun is bright, and the countdown clock is ticking. At 11:38 a.m. EST, Challenger is cleared for launch. T-10, 9, 8. The main engines roar to life. The shuttle rocks forward, straining against the bolts. 3, 2, 1, and lift off. The solid rocket boosters ignite. This is the moment of no return. 7 million pounds of thrust kick the ground. The sound is a physical force, a crackling roar that shakes the chest cavities of spectators 3 miles away. "Roll program, Houston," Scobie radios. "Roger, roll, Challenger," answers Mission Control. But an unseen camera, focused on the right solid rocket booster, captures something the human eye misses. At the exact moment of ignition, a small rubber seal inside the booster fails to behave as expected. The cold has changed it. For a few seconds, hot gases escape through a gap that should have sealed instantly. Challenger continues to climb, already carrying a failure that cannot be reversed. For nearly a minute, the shuttle climbs. It passes through max Q, the moment of maximum aerodynamic pressure. The shuddering is intense. The wind shear that day is the worst ever recorded for a shuttle launch. The vibration shakes the spacecraft, and it shakes the fragile plug of aluminum oxide loose. At 58 seconds, a small flickering flame appears on the side of the right booster. It looks like a blowtorch. It is pointing directly at the main external tank, the giant orange silo filled with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The flame grows. It becomes a plume of fire. It begins to burn through the strut holding the booster to the tank. Inside the cockpit, the crew feels a jolt, but they have no warning lights. The sensors are on the engines, not the boosters. They are flying inside a bomb, and they don't know it. "Challenger, go at throttle up," calls Mission Control. They are ordering Scobie to bring the main engines to 104% power. "Roger, go at throttle up," Scobie replies. It is the last human voice to be recorded from the flight. At 73 seconds, the physics of destruction takes over. The bottom strut of the right booster fails. The booster, now free at the bottom, pivots around the top strut. The nose of the booster crashes into the top of the external tank. Simultaneously, the flame burns through the tank's skin. Liquid hydrogen meets liquid oxygen. At 46,000 feet, traveling at Mach 192, Challenger is enveloped in a massive expanding cloud of vapor and fire. It is not exactly an explosion in the traditional sense. It is a structural disintegration. The aerodynamic forces, no longer slicing smoothly over the nose, catch the shuttle broadside. The forces exceed anything the shuttle was designed to survive. The vehicle disintegrates in seconds, but the crew cabin does not explode. It separates intact, continuing forward on its own momentum before gravity slowly takes over. On the ground, the applause hesitates. The cheering from the families in the VIP stands turns into a confused murmur. The announcer, Steve Nesbitt, staring at his data console, doesn't see the screen. He sees that communications have cut out. "Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation," he says, his voice devoid of emotion. Obviously a major malfunction. In the sky, the two solid rocket boosters, now free and uncontrolled, corkscrew wildly through the blue, sketching that horrifying Y shape in smoke that will become the symbol of the tragedy. For the millions watching, the brain refuses to process the data. Is this normal? Is this the booster separation? Then the camera zooms in. There is no shuttle. There is only falling debris. The silence that descends upon the Kennedy Space Center is heavier than the roar of the rockets. It is the silence of a dream dying. The horrifying spectacle in the sky over Florida does not end with the fireball. For the spectators on the ground and the millions glued to their televisions, the minutes following the explosion are a blur of cognitive dissonance. The white contrails hang in the air like a tombstone. Debris begins to rain down on the Atlantic Ocean. It is a slow, terrible rain. Pieces of fuselage, tiles, and twisted metal splash into the water for nearly an hour. The Coast Guard and Navy are scrambled immediately, but the recovery zone is treacherous. Falling metal is lethal. But amidst the search for answers, a darker, more haunting question begins to form. A question that NASA would try to keep out of the public eye for years. What happened to the crew? The initial assumption, the merciful assumption, was that the 7 astronauts died instantly when the external tank ruptured. The violence of the breakup at Mach 192 surely rendered them unconscious immediately. That was the story the world wanted to believe. It was the story that allowed the nation to sleep. However, when Navy divers finally located the crew cabin weeks later, sitting on the ocean floor in 100 feet of water, the evidence told a different, more chilling story. The cabin had not depressurized explosively. It was largely intact when it hit the water. Investigators found that 3 of the 4 personal egress air packs, PEEPs, emergency oxygen supplies, had been activated. They were manually turned on. Pilot Mike Smith's switch was located behind his seat. He could not have reached it himself. Either Ellison Onizuka or Judy Resnick had to have reached over and turned it on for him. This detail changes everything. It means that at least some of the crew were alive, conscious, and aware after the breakup. Imagine the horror of those 2 minutes and 45 seconds. That is how long the cabin fell. After separating from the fireball, the crew compartment continued to arc upward to a peak of 65,000 feet before beginning its long, silent plunge toward the ocean. There was likely no noise other than the rush of wind. The roar of the engines was gone. The intercom was dead. They were in free fall, tumbling inside a reinforced metal box, watching the blue sky and the dark ocean spin wildly in the windows. We will never know exactly what was said or felt in those final moments. But the activation of the air packs suggests they were fighting to survive all the way down. They were doing their jobs. They were astronauts until the very end. The impact with the water occurred at over 200 miles per hour. The force was over 200 Gs. That was the moment of death. The realization that they survived the explosion only to fall to their deaths adds a layer of profound tragedy to the disaster that goes beyond mere mechanical failure. In the days that followed, the nation went into mourning. President Reagan postponed the State of the Union. Instead, he addressed the nation from the Oval Office, delivering one of the most poignant speeches of the 20th century. He spoke directly to the school children who had watched their teacher die. I know it is hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. But as the tears dried, the anger began to rise. How could this happen? President Reagan appointed the Rogers Commission to investigate the accident. It was a heavyweight panel, including Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, and Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. But the wild card on the commission was a theoretical physicist from Caltech named Richard Feynman. Feynman was a Nobel Prize winner, a genius, and a man with zero patience for bureaucracy. He was dying of cancer, though few knew it at the time. He saw this investigation as his final act of service to the truth. While the NASA managers tried to overwhelm the commission with charts, graphs, and bureaucratic jargon, Feynman went rogue. He talked to the engineers. He talked to the guys turning the wrenches. He went to the factory. He discovered the secret of the O-rings. The O-rings were large rubber circles, 12 feet in diameter, designed to seal the joints between the segments of the solid rocket boosters. The investigation revealed that the rubber used, Viton, had a fatal flaw. When it got cold, it lost its memory. It wouldn't spring back into shape. On the day of the launch, with the temperature at 29 degrees Fahrenheit, the O-rings were as hard as hockey pucks. When the boosters ignited, the steel casing expanded, opening a gap. The frozen O-ring failed to expand to fill that gap. The hot gas blew past it, and the rest was history. But explaining this complex thermodynamic reaction to the public was difficult. NASA managers were still testifying that the data was inconclusive. They were obfuscating, trying to hide behind safety margins. Then came the moment that shattered the cover-up. During a televised hearing, Richard Feynman asked for a glass of ice water. As the cameras rolled and the NASA officials droned on, Feynman quietly took a piece of the O-ring material, clamped it with a C-clamp, and dropped it into the ice water. He let it sit there for a few minutes. Then he pulled it out and undid the clamp. The rubber stayed compressed. It didn't bounce back. Feynman held the deformed rubber up to the microphone. "I took this stuff that I got out of your seal, and I put it in ice water, and I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it doesn't stretch back. It stays the same dimension." In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there is no resilience in this particular material when it is at a temperature of 32 degrees. It was a devastatingly simple demonstration. In 10 seconds, with a glass of water, he proved that the shuttle was doomed before the countdown even began. The Rogers Commission report was scathing. It didn't just blame the O-ring. It blamed the culture of NASA. They called it the normalization of deviance. NASA had seen O-ring erosion on previous flights. It wasn't supposed to happen at all. But because nothing terrible had happened yet, they began to accept it as normal. They convinced themselves that the damage was within acceptable limits. They stopped treating the O-rings as a critical life safety component and started treating them as a maintenance issue. Furthermore, the report exposed the go fever. The pressure to launch, to meet the schedule, to please Congress, to get the teacher in space up there before the State of the Union, had silenced the engineers. The management structure at NASA had become so thick that the warnings from the people who knew the hardware best never reached the people making the final decision. The managers were thinking like politicians. They needed to be thinking like engineers. As Feynman famously wrote in his appendix to the report, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." The Challenger disaster didn't happen because of a single technical failure. It happened because a system learned to live with warning signs. Each successful launch made the next risk feel acceptable, until the risk finally became real. Safety isn't lost in dramatic moments. It's lost quietly, one decision at a time. The next time you see a rocket launch, watching that pillar of fire ascend into the black, remember that it is a controlled explosion. Remember the thousands of hands that touched it. And remember that physics does not negotiate. I'm Eddie, and this has been The Calm Before History. If this story moved you, or if you remember where you were when the Challenger fell, please share your memory in the comments below. It helps keep their legacy alive. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that defined our world. Good night, and stay safe.